Hey everybody, welcome back to Gen Psych. Today we're going to learn about psychological disorders. So let me share my screen with you real quick. So when you hear the term psychological disorders, a lot of feelings might come to mind. It might hit really close to home. Either you or someone you love or care about likely has a psychological disorder. In fact, about 26% of Americans have a diagnosable psychological disorder every given year. And a lot of psychological disorders tend to be comorbid, which means that you can experience more than one psychological disorder at the same time. So you might be thinking of like, well, what psychological disorders come to mind? Most popular ones, maybe anxiety, depression. You'd probably be surprised that anxiety and depression are not the most popular psychological or prevalent psychological disorders out there. In fact, substance use related disorders are. So like addiction and things like that. Other psychological disorders that come to mind, like schizophrenia, is actually pretty rare in the population. About 1% to 2% of people worldwide have schizophrenia. So you might be thinking, what are the criteria of having a diagnosable psychological disorder? And let me hit you with a good definition for your notes, and then we'll talk about specifically what psychologists have to say about diagnosing different psychological disorders. So for the record, a definition for your notes, a psych disorder is a mental condition. It's characterized by symptoms that do one of three things. It either creates significant distress, leads to some sort of impairment, so impedes your ability to go to work, go to school, interact with your family, like maintain healthy, normal relationships, or just live your life the way that you had done before. The third thing, psychological disorders can lead to significant risk of harm, either significant risk of harm to yourself or for other people. So getting back to those three things, that significant distress, it's not just feeling sad. It's not just, hey, this bothers me, but is so bothersome, is such an extreme emotion, extreme high, extreme worry, extreme sadness, that it's now no longer in like the kind of normal day-to-day range of emotions. It's something that's abnormal. The second piece is leading to some sort of impairment. So it's not just something, hey, like I can get by. It's starting to affect your life. It's affecting you being able to visit your family. If you are such a phobia of going outside, for instance, something like agoraphobia, or you are so incredibly sad with a clinical depression that you don't want to talk to people anymore, and all the things that used to bring you joy don't anymore. A trait called anhedonia, where people stop interacting, stop going to school, stop going to work, all those things that used to bring them joy, they kind of push back from. That's a problem. Now it's leading to impairment. And the last one is the significant risk of harm. This can be either harm to themselves, like suicide, or like suicide ideation, kind of thinking about it. It could be self-injurious behaviors, things like cutting and burning one's own flesh, as a means of like regaining control and like feeling something, even though it's pain that they're experiencing. Or it could be significant risk of harm to someone else, like in the case of oppositional defiant disorder, or antisocial personality disorder, or even psychopathy or sociopathy. So when you're thinking about, is this a psychological disorder, think about those three things. Is it distressing? Is it impairing? And is it a risk of harm to someone else or yourself? And psychologists often kind of lump those symptoms. Each psychological disorder has a variety of different symptoms. And some of the ways to kind of think about them in general would be cognitive, emotional, or behavior. Sometimes they call these the ABCs, the affect, behavior, cognition. But think of it as having a kind of cognitive, a mental perspective that's like something is disordered or abnormal in the way people are thinking about the world around them. It could be emotional, so either extreme highs or extreme lows that's leading to some sort of emotion that they're feeling, as well as some sort of behavioral change. So take clinical depression, for example. Some of the cognitive symptoms of clinical depression are these ideas of like hopelessness and worthlessness, and that life is not worth living, There's nothing I can say or do that's going to make a difference, so why kind of bother? That sort of pessimistic thinking would be a cognitive symptom. An emotional symptom would be something along the lines of just that incredible sadness. So not just this kind of normal day-to-day range of I'm happy, I'm sad, when good and bad things happen, but persistent, extreme levels of sadness day in and day out for a prolonged period of time that starts impairing their daily life. And lastly, for clinical depression, you also have behavioral components too. Something like sleeping much more, much less than often, eating much more, kind of gaining more weight, eating much less, losing a bunch of weight, engaging in suicide attempts, or engaging in like suicide ideation. So thinking about suicide would be a cognitive symptom, but engaging in the actual suicide attempt would be a behavioral symptom of clinical depression. And of the hundreds of different psychological disorders out there, each one has a variety of different cognitive, emotional, and behavioral symptoms. And in fact, you don't have to have every single symptom to be diagnosed with that psychological disorder. So you may be wondering, how do you classify these psychological disorders and how would you be diagnosed? Well, there's a manual called the DSM. It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It groups psychological disorders by mood disorders and identity disorders, dissociative disorders, anxiety disorders, things like that. And then within each of those general kind of categories, there are specific disorders like clinical depression, generalized anxiety, panic attacks, things like that. So what I'm going to do on the next few slides is talk about the general types, kind of classifications of psychological disorders, and then just touch on a few of the more prevalent examples of those psychological disorders within those categories. But for sure, this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, there's hundreds of different psychological disorders. And the criteria for each one are varied. Some psychological disorders have a variety of different symptoms. And during a diagnostic interview where you would be chatting with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, what they would be doing is asking you questions to see, hey, are you evidencing some of these patterns of thinking that are a symptom of that disorder? Are you engaging in some of the behaviors that are characteristic of that disorder? Are you feeling some of the emotions that are characteristic of that disorder? And depending on the specific disorder, if you have 5 of the 10 symptoms or 7 of the 15 symptoms out there, then you would have a clinical diagnosis of depression or a clinical diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. And that clinical diagnosis is important for a variety of reasons, including like insurance and healthcare and things like that. This is the 5th edition of the DSM. Clinical and counseling psychologists, like all psychologists, are continuing to do research. And what they're finding is that over time, some of the symptoms need to be updated. Some of the psychological disorders are more culturally specific. So they might be present in the US or other parts of the world, but not universal. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, I believe homosexuality was considered a psychological disorder. But since then, more research on homosexuality has come out, and the APA, American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, have since removed it as a psychological disorder because it doesn't meet the same criteria of extreme distress, impairment in daily life, or risk of harm to self or others. So anyway, new psychological disorders are also being added, like gambling addiction and what's called video game addiction, where it becomes so extreme that it starts impairing their ability to go to work and maintain relationships and starts harming themselves and others. So anyway, those are a lot of different psychological disorders. Let's talk about some of the characteristics of each one. So if you want to pause and do this quick activity, quickly think of some of the characteristics that you think of major depressive disorder. And what you'd find is in that list, right? Or what you could do is pull up the DSM online and look for characteristics or symptoms of major depressive disorder. What you would find is that all of those psychological disorders are going to have affective, behavioral, and cognitive components to them. So by affective, I'm referring to just like their feeling. So the kind of emotions, the feelings, the attitudes, the way they think about the world, and the behavior. And psychologists and psychiatrists, when they approach these psychological disorders and treatment, or why this person developed the psychological disorder in the first place, they typically approach the psychological disorder from a biopsychosocial model. Biopsychosocial. So biopsychosocial model, what this is referring to is the reason why some people develop psychological disorders and others don't. It could be their biology, it could be their psychology, or it could be their social environment. And in fact, because we know so much about people, we know it's actually a combination of all three of those. And you can't just focus on one in isolation of the other two. So that's why this biopsychosocial model gets so much play and is so influential in the field of abnormal psychology and a variety of therapies. So first one, let's talk about the bio and the biopsychosocial model. The bio, think of what are the biological factors? These might be medical or kind of neurobiological. What are some of the things going on in this person's brain? Are they producing too much serotonin, not enough serotonin? If they aren't producing enough serotonin, which we know is linked to one of those kind of feel-good neurotransmitters, if they aren't producing enough of that, then they're going to experience more of the kind of sad affect, right? They're going to feel more depressed in general. So in fact, what you find is antidepressants like SSRIs, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil will work just on influencing serotonin specifically. And what they find is that those work because they affect the biology of it. In fact, we'll look at levels of dopamine when it comes to schizophrenia and hallucinations and things like that. There's certainly a biological piece to psychological disorders. There's also the psycho piece, so kind of psychological piece. Think of these as occurring at the person level. These are often the way that they think about the world. So if someone is experiencing a fear of spiders or a fear of snakes, if they live in an area where there's cobras and like all sorts of venomous snakes out there, then being scared of snakes would be a rational fear, right? If you have an allergy that if you get stung by a bee and you could have this allergic reaction and die, then like being a little hesitant, being a little scared around bees would be a rational fear. But as soon as it kind of breaches over into this irrationality, you have such a fear of snakes, such a fear of bees that you can't watch the bee movie on TV. You can't be, scrolling through Disney Plus because then all of a sudden on the Nature, National Geographic channel, like a snake pops up. Or you can't open your mail because on the cover of a magazine might be a cover of a snake. That's irrational. So it's unlikely to occur. It's leading to this irrational fear, even when you know it's fake, even when you know it's on TV and it's not going to be able to sting you or bite you or anything like that. It's going on in between the person's ears, right? How they're thinking about this problem. And in fact, phobias are incredibly simple to treat. In fact, there's some phobias that can be treated in a single day in a single setting. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't know that, and you have a high prevalence of phobias existing throughout people's lives, which is unfortunate. There's also a kind of social component. So it's kind of social, cultural things that are all around you, the time at which you live, the culture with which you live. And what you find is the sort of norms and people around you and the ways of kind of believing that are common in your time, in your country, will affect the different psychological disorders that you experience. So for instance, think about like anxiety and the idea of being like a failure, not living up to other people's expectations. If you live in a culture that really values like education and going to college and um, being successful, being a very collectivistic culture where it's really important for you to like do your entire neighborhood proud and do your city proud and do your family proud, like live up to really high expectations for other people. What you find in collectivistic cultures like Japan, unique psychological disorders that only affect um, uh, uh, people in Japan and other kind of collectivistic cultures when they find out that they don't get a job after undergrad, or when they find out that they don't get accepted into college. You have really uh, unique psychological disorders of kind of self-isolating, of locking themselves in their rooms, not speaking for months, not feeling the same sort of like pleasure and all the things that used to bring them joy, which is a really unique psychological disorder just to Japan. In China, there's more restrictive beliefs about kind of sexuality and like sex outside of marriage and watching pornography and things like that. And what you find is a psychological disorder called Koro, which is only present in some of those kind of sexually restrictive cultures, where people will have this irrational belief that if they engage in too much masturbation, or if they watch pornography, or if they have sex outside of marriage, or have sex with a prostitute, or engage in some sort of like unwholesome sexual behavior, they have this irrational belief that their penis will retract inside their body and kill them, which is irrational, right? It's not going to happen, but it's culture specific. You don't see those same sort of diagnoses in the United States as you do in China and Japan and things like that. There's also Cavade syndrome, which occurs in the US, to pick on us for a little bit, as one of the psychological disorders of where men, husbands, can have phantom pregnancies. They start experiencing the same sort of distended stomachs, the same sort of like pregnancy pains and all those sort of like psychosomatic illnesses, because they aren't actually pregnant, obviously, but out of this like extreme empathy, this extreme connection, they can experience the same sort of pregnancy like symptoms as their partner. So it's important when you look at any psychological disorder, what's going on biologically, what's going on at the individual level, how they're thinking about the world, kind of psychology, and then social, keeping in mind their environment around them and the culture that they live in. Because none of us are no people are islands. We're surrounded by each other, for better or for worse. So one of the questions that always comes up, and it's a really important one, is why do some people develop mental disorders but not others? So you might have siblings and one might experience depression and the other one doesn't, or cousins and one might have an anxiety disorder and the other one doesn't. You might have soldiers in the same platoon, in the same front lines in Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and they're walking down the streets of Afghanistan, for instance, and all of a sudden a bomb goes off on the side of the road, and you have one person develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the other soldier sitting right next to him doesn't. They both experience the exact same traumatic event. Why did one person develop the psychological disorder, PTSD, but the other one didn't? And one of the things I want you to be really familiar with is the reason why some people develop psychological disorders and others don't is because of a diathesis stress model. So diathesis stress model. The diathesis is that genetic predisposition to having a psychological disorder, meaning does it run in your genes? If you have this genetic predisposition, mom had major depression, dad had major depression, grandma had major depression, grandpa had major depression. Like if it runs in the family, it's likely that you will develop depression as well as an adult, but not always. You have to have that diathesis, that genetic predisposition, paired with the stress. So diathesis stress model. This stress is referring to some sort of situational or environmental trigger that you experience. So if you went through your entire life and you had this really strong diathesis for depression, runs in your veins, but you didn't experience a sufficient enough stressor, you aren't going to develop major depression. The same way when you start looking at those two soldiers, some soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan have very weak or, a small diathesis, meaning anxiety disorder of like PTSD. Mom didn't have it, dad didn't have it, grandma, grandpa didn't have it, great grandma and grandpa didn't have it. Anybody can develop PTSD if they experience a high enough stressor. So they, didn't just see 9/11 on TV, but they were there at ground zero, or they were like in the front lines experiencing this stressor day in, day out, over and over again, constantly patrolling streets after street, of a war-torn country. If the stressor is perceived to be significantly high enough, meaning in their perception, if it was so extreme, anybody could develop a psychological disorder. But if you have a weak disposition, right, a weak diathesis for developing a psychological disorder, notice how high that stress has to be before you kick over into this kind of red area over here. That would be diagnosing of the psychological disorder. But now notice, as soon as the diathesis gets a little bit stronger, right? Mom and dad have anxiety disorders, and grandpa had PTSD when he was in the Korean War and things like that. Now notice that it kind of runs in the family, right? The diathesis is a lot stronger. So when you do experience a stressor, right, you would develop a psychological disorder. But notice that the threshold for how stressful that event has to be is much smaller, right? The threshold down here is much lower if you have a strong diathesis. So this model right here does a really nice job of saying what happens when people experience the same kind of stressful event, right? This kind of threshold point right here. If they have a strong diathesis, they're likely to land in the red, right? And develop a psychological disorder. Whereas if they have a very weak diathesis, right? No family history of it, that same stressful event that they experience isn't likely to create a psychological disorder within them. This is true for a variety of different psychological disorders. I picked on a few like depression and PTSD, but you see the same thing when it comes to schizophrenia. So schizophrenia, of all of the psychological disorders, has a strong genetic predisposition piece to it. But if you don't encounter a specific stressor, then you are unlikely to develop schizophrenia. Most people develop schizophrenia between like 18 to 25 when they're experiencing a lot of stressors of like moving out away from mom and dad, going to college for the first time. So for some people, like that stress of being in college, right, is a sufficient stressor, but if they have no genetic predisposition, they're unlikely to develop schizophrenia. But if it kind of runs in their family, strong diathesis, that same stressful event of like going to college or having a really bad breakup or experiencing the stress of a global pandemic, for instance, is sufficient to trigger psychological disorders. So next, I want to talk about some of the different kind of classifications within the DSM. So remember, the DSM was a diagnostic and statistical manual for mental disorders. So first, I want to talk about mood disorders. And again, there are a ton of different mood disorders, but let me just define what mood disorders are in general, and then I'll talk about some of the more kind of prevalent ones. So what is a mood disorder? It is a persistent or episodic disturbance in emotion that interferes with normal functioning in at least one realm of life. So notice here, it can either be persistent, meaning every single day of your life for months and months and months, you're feeling really, really sad, or you're feeling over the top excited, agitated, right? It could be persistent, or it could be kind of episodic, meaning like for a few days or a few weeks, I feel really high, and then a few more weeks and days, I feel really low. It could be more of these kind of episodes of someone's life, which seems a lot more characteristic of bipolar disorder, for instance. So anyway, mood disorders can be either persistent or episodic in emotion. and they trigger the psychological disorder because they start interfering with normal life, meaning that they start impairing this person's ability to get along with their family, start impairing this person's ability to form and maintain romantic relationships. Their friends no longer want to be their friends. Their employers are firing them because of these either persistent or episodic disturbances in their emotion. Notice as soon as it starts interfering with at least one domain of their life, then it kind of gets triggered over into a mood disorder. And there are a variety of different mood disorders out there. The first one is major depressive disorder. So think about like the ABCs, the affect, behavior, cognition. Some of the characteristics are just sad mood. I'm not referring to as, well, that stinks, I'm feeling a little depressed today. In major depressive disorder, this is an extreme sad mood that can either be linked to a particular event, like the loss of a loved one, which it's warranted, right? You loved and cared about someone really deeply, like you should have a sad mood, but is it lingering for for months at a time, so much so that now you aren't leaving the house, you aren't going grocery shopping, you aren't eating as much as you used to. Now that sad mood is persistent and it's starting to creep over into interfering in your life via these different behaviors that you're engaging in. So another characteristic of major depressive disorder is less interest in previous activities. The fancy psych word for this is called anhedonia. Anhedonia. And that's just meaning that all the things that used to bring you joy, not so much anymore. You used to love watching basketball and playing basketball, now not so much. You used to love talking on the phone with your friends, and now it's like not so much, right? Anhedonia, lack of kind of interest and passion in things that used to bring you joy. And the cognitions in major depressive disorder are these irrational thoughts about the self-worth. Irrational thoughts mean like, I'm a failure, I'm a screw up, no one will miss me if I'm gone. That's irrational. There are a ton of people within your social network that although they may not tell you that they love you and care about you every single day, they truly do. So these irrational thoughts that the world would be a better place if I wasn't in it, that's false. This is just a really rough time. It's just a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and the world will get better. Your life will get better after this. But people with major depressive disorders, one of the characteristics is this decreased kind of problem solving, meaning they can't think about other solutions as well. So one of the behaviors associated with major depressive disorder is suicide ideation, thinking about it, suicide attempts, or even successful suicides, where people unfortunately take their own life. And when people have been like rejected and isolated and extremely depressed for long periods of time, they often refer to suicide as the ultimate failure to problem solve. That they can't think of how the world's gonna be better tomorrow, or how there's any other way of dealing with this one slip up or this one mistake that they made. And they engage in this kind of binary thinking of either I have to live my entire life this way or end it. And that's not true. There's so many other ways of brainstorming new solutions, and the world is going to get better. So next week we'll talk about cognitive therapies in major depressive disorders. One of those psychological disorders that's treated really well by focusing on challenging and correcting these irrational thoughts that people have about themselves, because it leads to a vicious cycle. Well, the reason why I'm alone is because no one likes me, and no one invites me out because no one likes me. It's like, well, maybe the reason why you aren't being invited is because like you aren't leaving your home and you aren't returning phone calls. You're not reaching out to people the same way that you were before. So it leads to these sort of cycles. And people with major depressive disorders will explain the world in ways that justifies this low self-esteem that they have about themselves. Even when good things happen, it was a fluke. Or when bad things happen that were just dumb luck, there was just a really bad situation. Oh, it's because me, I'm a terrible driver, I'm a terrible person, no one likes me. So they're making attributions about their behavior in a way that maintains this low self-esteem. There are gender differences within major depressive disorder. Um, Women are more likely to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, partly because women are stereotypically built up in America in ways our stereotypic gender roles are being revealed, is that it's okay for girls to talk about their emotions. Guys feel emotions the exact same way. Although guys are more socialized, particularly within certain families and certain cultures, to have more of this sort of machismo. Keep a stiff upper lip and don't let it bother you. So what you find when people are talking about describing their symptoms, what you find is men and women will often report different symptoms when they're talking about depression. Men might say things like, well, I'm having a hard time sleeping lately. Or, like my stomach just seems to be really upset. Or, like all the things I used to do don't bring me that much joy anymore. Notice how all those things are more like behaviors. My sleep is changing, my food is changing, my relationships are changing. Like it's not me, it's not how I'm feeling, it's the outside world. Whereas women have been socialized and equipped with a lot more of the skills to share their emotions and process their emotions amongst other people. So there are gender differences in reported psychological disorders, but also in some of the symptoms as well. Unfortunately, there are gender differences when it comes to suicide attempts as well. Women are significantly more likely to attempt suicide, whereas men are significantly more likely to die from suicide every year. So more men die from suicide than women do every year. And the way that you can kind of rationalize those, it's like, how are more men dying from suicide if women are attempting suicide more often? It's because of gender differences in the means of attempting suicide. Men who attempt suicide tend to do so in more lethal, more extreme ways, such as, shooting, hanging, things like that, that are far more lethal than taking pills, for instance. Although both can, although both are certainly lethal, you know, hanging and firearms are far more lethal. So what you find is men gravitate more towards the more lethal means of suicide. So even though they attempt suicide more often, or although men attempt suicide less often, they tend to be more successful in their fewer attempts. Let me pause here. Suicide is something that is all too common. It pops up throughout people's lifespan, right? In high school, you might have heard or known or, cared about someone that committed suicide. And I want to tell you right now that asking about suicide, say, hey, like you just going up to someone that you care about and say, hey, like I care about you and I've noticed that you've been different. You seem a lot sadder. Have you ever had any weird thoughts lately? You ever like thought about suicide? Um, Asking that question does not plant the seed. Asking the question does not make them any more likely to commit suicide. In fact, being able to ask people about their depression and ask about their suicide ideation shows them that there is a sense of social support out there. It actually makes them less likely to commit suicide. So having that conversation is really important. And I use the high school example because that's close in age, relevant to you guys that have just come out of high school and are in college and going through a lot of stressful life events right now. But what you find is this huge spike in suicide attempts amongst the elderly as well. So amongst the elderly, you might find kind of social changes in the size of their social network. So the people that they loved and cared about and spent so much of their lives with maybe passing away. Some of the faculties of sight and vision and hearing and all the things that they used to like be able to kind of take for granted start kind of slipping away, and their life wasn't the way that it was before. All the freedom to be socially connected that they used to engage in, like being able to drive to their friend's house, for instance, were all ways of fostering social connection. Those have now been taken away. And what you find is increases in loneliness and depression, and unfortunately suicide occurs as well. Another mood disorder is bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, so bi meaning two, as kind of poles, you're kind of going back and forth between the extremes here. In bipolar disorder, you have these manic states. So these periods of like, life is awesome, and like optimism and energy and bursting with ideas. Like you can't sit still. You're talking really fast. You're bouncing up and down the walls. You don't want to sleep. You want to stay up all night. You want to keep playing that game. You want to keep painting just for, kicks. You want to just like be around other people, and like you're in this manic, really awesome state, right? This really like uh, high, this energetic period. So you may decide, you know what, I want to um, blow off class on Friday and let's go to Vegas and let's go right now. Let's drive through the night. And what you find is people in these manic states might drive to Vegas and blow all of the money that they needed for rent that month or tuition for next semester. So they start making these manic decisions in these hyper states that that will lead to a bunch of sadness and distress later on. They may be in these kind of highs of like drinking too much and partying too much and using too many drugs, and then getting behind the wheel and getting busted for driving under the influence. And those sort of poor decisions will create more distress down the road. They may engage in more safe, kind of unsafe sexual practices because, hey, they went to Vegas and life was fun, exciting, and they had sex with some prostitute without protection. But the manic state, the mania, doesn't last forever. It comes back down. So when people start thinking about, oh my gosh, how much money did I lose last night? What did I do? Why did I get my license taken away because I was driving under the influence? Why did I have sex with that person without wearing a condom, without using some sort of protection? And these people now are becoming really worried about the cost of that mania, and it leads to kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of like spiraling downwards from there when they start to think about all the negative, poor decisions that they made in that manic state. So when people are clinically depressed, they literally move slower. They talk slower. They have less energy, enthusiasm about life. But in this bipolar disorder is that depression doesn't last forever. It spirals back with a manic, and you start fluctuating in these different episodes over time. There's also, for those of you that are curious, a couple different types. There's bipolar 1, bipolar 2. You'll learn a lot more about that in an abnormal psychology course. So there's a whole course just on all these different psychological disorders and diagnosing them. But the main difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 is like how quickly you go back and forth between the poles of highs and lows. Another mood disorder that is common, but less common in sunny Southern California, is seasonal affective disorder, SAD for short, SAD, seasonal affective disorder. Seasonal affective disorder affects people in really cloudy areas and really kind of rainy areas where they don't get exposed to the sun for whole months at a time. What they find is that they start feeling the same sort of depression symptoms. So some of the effective treatments for seasonal affective disorder is like UV lights. So being exposed to kind of wavelengths that mirror the sun's light, just being around, just seeing light increases people's moods in this case. So what's going on with these mood disorders? Let's again tackle this from a biopsychosocial perspective. From a bio, let's not forget about serotonin, right? We know it's a feel-good neurotransmitter. We know it occurs in the person, right? The psycho of how they're thinking about the world. In fact, Aaron Beck, one of the psychologists we'll talk about next chapter when it talks about cognitive therapies, says that there are negative triads that occur within mood disorders. People think negatively about themselves, they think negatively about the world around them, and they think negatively about the future, right? That's sort of pessimism. I'm not good enough, the world's gonna reject me, and you know what, tomorrow's not gonna be any better than today. Those are irrational beliefs. So cognitive therapies are gonna challenge those irrational beliefs. Some other kind of cognitive symptoms are kind of cognitive distortions. So catastrophizing is one of those cognitive distortions, saying things like, you know what, yep, bombed this one class. Yep, I failed exam 2 in Gen Psych. Most of us would kind of stop right there and say, well, like that stinks. What can we do later? What can we start making changes so we don't do well on the next exam and we salvage this semester? With people with these diagnosable mood disorders like major depression, they engage in kind of catastrophizing, this cognitive distortion of thinking, well, if I failed exam 2, then that means I'm going to fail this Gen Psych class, and Gen Psych is on my GEs, and if I don't pass on my GEs, then I'll never graduate from college, and then I'll be a dropout, I'll have all this debt. What am I going to do? I'm going to have to work at a job, and because I'm a college dropout, I won't have any employer, so I'll have to work at McDonald's, and all of a sudden, like, someone's going to come into McDonald's and start yelling at me. I'm gonna get angry and they're gonna pull a gun. I'm gonna get shot and I'm gonna die on the floor of a bloody McDonald's, all because you failed exam 2. No, like, that's over the top catastrophizing. But it's one of those kind of cognitive distortions that people can lead with. And then this last one, negative attributions. Attributions, think about that social psych chapter. People explain the world around them. Why did that person do that? Right? Why did that person break up with me? Was it them? Were they going through something, or was it me? Notice that most people, right, who don't experience major depression disorder have these self-serving biases, right? Oh, well, they broke up with me. It's their loss. They're going through something. It's not me. Or I failed this exam because the test was really poorly written, or they're out to get me. The professor like really dislikes me or something. Notice how they make attributions that are really flattering to themselves. And when good things happen, like they ace that exam, it's because I'm smart. Or they get invited to that party, it's like, oh, because other people like having me around, right? They make attributions that are very flattering. With people with major depression disorder and other types of negative mood disorders, those attributions flip. Why did they fail? Oh, it's because I'm not smart. That's the truth. Well, why did you pass this other class? Oh, it was overly easy and the professor wasn't taking it seriously. And, it's like, well, why did they invite you to that party then? Oh, they probably felt bad for me. That's why they invited me. Notice how those attributions are different in a way that they're rationalizing why you're feeling bad about yourself. So that's why cognitive therapies, which we'll talk about next week, are so effective for treating mood disorders. And not to downplay the social part of biopsychosocial, you just look at the risk of developing depression with like the number of stressful life events. There's some people, right, that don't need a sufficient stressor, like less than 5% of people will just develop depression just because of that strong of a diathesis. But notice once the kind of stressors in life start adding up, you start getting up to that curve, and even people with low diathesis start developing major depression. So a loved one dies, you lose your job. It's like, okay, that really stinks, but still, like, people are resilient and they cope, and their friends and family come along, and like social assistance programs come along. But then the third thing's, like as soon as that third stressor hits, then your house gets hit by a tornado, or then you get diagnosed with some disease or something like that. Like as soon as you have that third stressor, notice how the risk of depression just shoots right up. So it's really a combination of biopsychosocial, and you can't downplay the effect of any one of those three. So life stressors for sure. The next classification of disorders I want to talk about is anxiety disorders. There's a few different anxiety disorders that are increasing over time, which some might wonder, is that because people are becoming more anxious over time, or are there more psychologists out there that are getting more word out and they're being a lot more informant on what is normal, what is abnormal, and effective therapies? It's really a combination of both. Anxiety disorders are increasing over time, but so is knowledge of the role of anxiety and how it affects people's performance at their job, at school, and so on. So the first type of anxiety disorder I want to talk about is GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. And this is just excessive anxiety. So, it's normal to feel like stress. Right? It's normal to feel a little bit like uneasy at times, when you're going into a job interview, when you're walking into the test, like that's normal nerves. That's, but when it starts becoming over the top every single day, even without like a singular cause that should invoke worry, it's like, why am I at home and feeling anxious? Why am I walking around the grocery store feeling this sort of anxiety? Without a singular cause, this high level, just persistent across time of anxiety is characteristic of generalized anxiety disorder. And in fact, there are anxiolytics which are effective, as well as types of therapy that change people's attributions and social support networks that can uh, help alleviate anxiety, like group therapy and so on. But anyway, we'll talk all about therapy next chapter. Another type of anxiety disorder is panic disorder, which by itself is characteristic of these panic attacks. So a panic attack is occurs when someone is experiencing so much anxiety that they have this intense fear, anxiety, discomfort that starts manifesting itself in both physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. So the physical symptoms, they start hyperventilating, start breathing really fast. The room feels like it's spinning. They feel out of control. They feel like their head starts getting lighter. And they start thinking about the world differently. Their thoughts start to race. They start to feel like this is like a fight or flight response and they need to run or they need to fight. And with panic disorder, people can have panic disorder, which is just with panic attacks. Or panic attacks can be kind of comorbid or can co-occur with, other types of psychological disorders. So someone could have depression and panic attacks, or generalized anxiety disorder with reoccurring panic attacks. And panic attacks can be really dangerous because if someone's driving a car, for instance, men who aren't as willing to kind of open up about the feelings of stress and pressure that they might feel just normal day to day, aren't coping with their anxiety in effective ways. So what they might report is like, I felt like I was having a heart attack. It's like, well, that was just that sort of tightness of all of those muscles, that kind of pressure that you felt. That was the hyperventilating, the room spinning. It might have seemed like a heart attack, but it wasn't. It was actually just a panic attack. A third type of anxiety disorder is a phobia, right? And there are a ton of different phobias out there. But the thing to keep an eye out for is, what is a phobia? It is intense and it is irrational. So if you are walking down a street, for instance, and you see like a rabid dog with like foam coming out of its mouth and things barking, it's like running at you, like it is rational to be fearful of that animal, right? Because it doesn't look healthy. It looks like it's going to bite you. Like that's a rational fear. But what about fears that are irrational? Like you were bitten by a puppy when you were a kid, and now you can't live anywhere near a dog park because just hearing a dog barking fills you with that same sort of panic attack. It makes you feel really anxious and tight and nervous and all those sort of things. When someone gives you a puppy for your birthday and you start breaking down in tears because you can't handle that, that's irrational, right? The dog barking outside, you aren't in a threatening situation, right? A puppy dog isn't a rational threat the same way that a rabid dog was earlier. So this sort of irrationality is the characteristic of a phobia. And here's a really cool link. I would encourage you to hit pause right now and watch this video. It's of an exposure therapy session, which we'll talk about next chapter, of this of a psychologist working with a really big, strong man who has a phobia of dogs, taking him to a dog park. And you see this grown man who's big and strong and is trying so hard to be strong for his daughters, just breaking down and start crying, right? Starts weeping over the idea of a puppy dog kind of approaching him. That's that sort of intense irrationality that's characteristic of phobias. And next week, we'll talk about a variety of different ways of treating phobias. We'll talk about what's going on in this video specifically. And phobias, for being so common, um, phobias can be reversed and be taken away even within a single setting, a single therapy session. But people don't know that, and people don't go to therapy as often as they should for fear of stigma and perceived costs and barriers and things like that. Talking more about phobias, there's social phobias, right? So being afraid of like social events, like kind of social anxiety disorder. This fear of like talking to other people, of being in front of a group, being put on the spot. And what you find is that these social phobias have a lifetime prevalence of about 12%. So more than 1 in 10 people will have a social phobia throughout their lifespan. And it's important to note that psychological disorders can be treated. These phobias can be taken away. And there's a variety of different therapies we'll talk about next chapter to help people, to equip them with this. In addition to these social phobias, there's also specific phobias, where people might have a specific phobia of flying, or a specific phobia of snakes or spiders or things like that. You can develop a specific phobia for anything because phobias are learned. We noticed this with Watson and Rayner's study on little Albert. Remember the little baby that they kind of put in this room, and all of a sudden they put a little white rat next to it and they bang the 2 metal bars behind little Albert's head? Created this phobia, created this fear response. You can teach phobias about anything. You could develop a phobia of using the iPad, for instance, like that could be a phobia, but it's not likely. In fact, some phobias are far more common, are so much easier to develop, like a fear of spiders. There's a reason why more people have a fear of spiders than a fear of iPads. And the reasons why is because of this genetic predisposition that it is biologically adaptive for us to be fearful of things that may have a real threat to us. So what psychologists refer to this as a kind of biological preparedness. So given the kind of biological threat of a black widow, we are prepared, so it's easier to learn phobias for things like that. So what happened when, so let's say if you have a fear of spiders, what probably happened when you were a kid, you might have been bitten by a spider and it hurt. And that was that sort of association that you needed. And it was painful enough and aversive enough, and you didn't need to get bit by any other spider to know that, hey, this is something I should fear. Some people have fear of spiders and they never even experience a bite themselves. But all of a sudden they're playing in the backyard and they say, hey mom, look at all these spiders on my arm. And mom freaks out. Mom starts yelling and screaming and just like rushes and wipes all the spiders off and is now bawling and freaking out and like screaming at his kid, don't you ever do that to me again. Don't you ever play with these spiders. And what was so intense about that sort of reaction is now the kid was like, whoa, like I didn't have any strong feelings about these animals, about these spiders before, but I saw how intense you got. I saw how freaked out everyone else became and how they started yelling and screaming at me. And they made that sort of association. Some of those real threats of spiders and snakes have a biological preparedness, so it's easier to learn those types of phobias. But still, fear of spiders, fear of snakes can also be unlearned. On a personal note, my grandmother has this incredibly irrational fear of snakes. And I remember as a kid, like flipping through TV, and all of a sudden there would be like an advertisement for the LA Zoo, and there'd be a person holding a snake, and she would just shudder, like ooh, and like distance herself, and like couldn't watch that. She couldn't see any magazines that had a snake, and God forbid my younger brother was playing with a plastic snake one time, and she flipped out. She knew it was fake. She knew it was on TV. She knew it was a magazine. There wasn't a real threat, but still had that same kind of real fear response to this irrational belief. Fear of flying, fear of public speaking, fear of the dentist. There are a ton of different phobias out there. In fact, the DSM is full of them. And all of those phobias can be unlearned over time as well. Let's see here. Another type of anxiety disorder is OCD. It stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. And people throw around this term all the time. They're like, oh, you're being so OCD because you like your room cleaned. That's not what they're referring to here. With OCD, what they're specifically referring to is obsessions and compulsions. So in OCD, people have obsessive thoughts that are intrusive, meaning that they are shooting into someone's conscious awareness and they're persistent and they are bothering them and they don't want them there. And these obsessive thoughts might be, hey, someone might break into your house and murder you while you're sleeping tonight. And that obsessive thought just keeps popping in. Hey, you know what? They're break-ins. Hey, someone walking down the street, someone might break into your house tonight. And it just comes up persistent, upsetting, and they have these obsessive thoughts where they can't think of anything else. They just keep ruminating on this obsessive thought that someone might be breaking into their house. So to deal with that obsessive thought, they engage in the compulsion. And the compulsion is this repetitive behavior that reduces the anxiety caused by their obsession. So they start saying, you know what, like, yeah, like someone might break in, I'm gonna lock my door, lock. And doing that alleviate that anxiety a little bit. So now the thought comes back, oh, yep, someone might break in, let me lock it. Did I really lock it? Is that lock really locked, or might it slip a little bit? Let me do it twice. So now you have this kind of pattern of every few minutes locking and unlocking the door twice just to make sure that's locked. So you engage in these sort of repetitive behaviors, these compulsions. The whole reason why you're engaging in these compulsions is to deal with the unwanted, upsetting, persistent, obsessive thoughts. So there are a lot of different compulsions out there. There's the compulsion cleaning, and it probably stems from the obsessive thought is there's germs. There's germs out there, and germs can make people sick, and I don't want to get sick and die. And they look around the world and they're like, I don't smell bleach. That means there's germs out there. So they start scrubbing things, and they keep scrubbing things over and over and over again. They start washing their hands because washing your hands is a great way to get rid of germs. But after they're done washing, they're thinking, you know what, like there might still be some germs. So they keep washing their hands over and over and over again. And now their hands are raw and bloody because they've washed and scrubbed their skin off. Right? Now it's no longer a problem. Now it's a psychological disorder because that obsessive thought and compulsive behavior is causing harm to themselves and others. They're late for work because they're washing their hands so much. They're getting poor grades in college because they have to step out of class to wash their hands. Notice now how like normal hand washing, which is normal and encouraged, has shifted over to this compulsive behavior that is characteristic of OCD. Another type of compulsive behavior is counting. And that same way of like, whatever behavior you can engage in that gives you some sort of like normalcy to alleviate the obsessive thought of, you know what, things are out of place. And when things are out of place, things get, you know, missed or forgotten about, and bad things happen. So you start, you know, counting like 1, 3, 5 or something. And you have all sorts of strange patterns that people can engage in to alleviate their obsessive thoughts. And if you're interested in anxiety disorders and things like this, I would highly encourage you to take a class like Psych 360, Abnormal Psychology. So it's all about exploring all of these different psychological disorders in a lot more depth. Another type of anxiety disorder is PTSD. And we've talked about PTSD a little bit so far, but it stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. So earlier I used the example of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan developing PTSD. People can develop PTSD in a variety of other settings as well. It's exposure to any traumatic event. If you experience a traumatic event in the hospital, for example, you witnessed a loved one you really cared about pass away very suddenly while you're at the hospital. Later on, when you start watching the show, what's called ER, for instance, or like Grey's Anatomy, you can start developing the same sort of extreme fear and anxiety and like pressure, you know, symptoms. If someone has been sexually assaulted, for instance, that is absolutely a traumatic event that can develop PTSD-like symptoms when this person watches a romance movie and the couple's about to make love, or they're in another romantic relationship and their new partner kind of puts their hand on their shoulder or rubs their back or something like that. And it brings back some of those memories that are linked to that previously traumatic event. It doesn't just have to be war, it can be any trauma. And in PTSD, what you tend to have are these symptoms that are persistent re-experiencing of traumatic events. So when you experience that traumatic event, your amygdala and your hippocampus were going nuts. Your amygdala is saying, hey, this is threatening. You need to be worried about this right now. Your amygdala's going nuts. And your hippocampus is saying, remember this, remember every single thing. Who was there, what it looked like, what the grass smelled like, everything around. So later on, when you find yourself in a similar situation, you can avoid a situation like this again, because you want to lock into that memory to be able to avoid it at all costs, because it was so traumatizing and threatening to you. The problem is for that soldier that comes back, all of a sudden on the 4th of July, the fireworks go off, and it sounds similar to that bomb going off on the side of the road, and all those memories start flooding back. So any sort of like persistent re-experiencing through dreams, through similar events, brings back that same painful memories and the same sort of arousal that they can't move on. And there are, next chapter, a variety of different ways of treating PTSD, a variety of different therapies that are effective. Let's see here, another classification. So far we've talked about mood disorders, we've talked about anxiety disorders. I want to talk about schizophrenia for a second here. For those of you that have watched the movie It's a Beautiful Mind starring, what's his name, Russell Crowe. It's based on a true story of John Nash. It's a really cool film, and it does a really nice job of kind of showing the like humanity and the struggles of dealing with the hallucinations and delusions that are characteristic of schizophrenia. So anyway, if you're bored and want to watch a movie, A Beautiful Mind is a great one. So what is schizophrenia? Schizophrenia is a pattern of severely disturbed thinking, feeling, perceiving, and behavior. So your thoughts are irrational. The emotions that you're feeling are irrational. Perceptions, you might be feeling things, seeing things that aren't truly there, and acting in ways based on all these irrational thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions that you're having that aren't appropriate. What you find is that schizophrenia occurs in about 1% to 2% of the world population. And it tends to develop in adolescence or early adulthood, mostly when people start going to, the 18 to 24, when they start going to college for the first time. In schizophrenia, there are a variety of symptoms. There are positive symptoms and negative symptoms. When I use the term positive, don't think, oh, that's like a good symptom. When a positive symptom, think of positive meaning like in addition to. So in addition to all the normal functioning that most people have, a positive symptom is like something in addition to. So one of these positive symptoms is a delusion. And a delusion is this kind of irrational thought. You might have a delusion of grandeur. So you might have this false belief that you are Jesus reincarnated and you're here to save the world. That would be the sort of delusion. You could have a delusion of persecution. You might firmly believe that the FBI or CIA are coming after you, that they bugged your house and things like that. Those are all these kind of false beliefs that people believe to be true. And because this is in addition, right, to normal functioning, it's a positive symptom called a delusion. Another positive symptom of schizophrenia is a hallucination. And a hallucination can be visual, right? You can see something that isn't truly there. It can be auditory. You can hear something that's not truly there. It can be somatic, right? You can feel bugs walking on your skin when there aren't any bugs on your skin at all. So it's this kind of false perception that people have. And what's interesting is when you put people with diagnosable schizophrenia into an fMRI machine and you look at their brain, you see what's going on, what sort of pattern of neurons are being activated and firing. What you see when they're experiencing a visual hallucination, you see a sort of activation in the occipital lobe back here, right, the back of their head. Their brain is literally firing like they're seeing someone. So that person looks real. The same way that I look real, in this little box up here for you, you see me and you hear me. When they're experiencing a visual hallucination, they see someone who looks just as real. And it's hard to carry on conversations with someone else when you're having an auditory hallucination, because you might hear a voice like mine that's talking to you. Some of these auditory hallucinations can talk to you, and they can either be positive and encouraging, or they can be negative and demeaning and really distracting. Right? Nice voices and mean voices. You can have multiple voices occurring at the same time. You can hear multiple people talking to each other, and they can either be talking to each other about something else that you're not doing. They can be talking to you about something. So it can be really distracting whenever you're trying to have a conversation. And like, imagine having earphones on and you're hearing another conversation, or you're listening to a podcast at the same time. It's really distracting. And some of these positive symptoms are disordered behavior. So they are acting on these delusions and hallucinations in ways that doesn't make sense. Another characteristic of schizophrenia is disorganized speech. And there's different types of schizophrenia I'll talk about in a second. But one of the characteristics is this like speech that's hard to understand, that they're talking a lot, they're using a lot of words, but it doesn't seem to be making a whole lot of sense. This is referred to as word salad. So in word salad, think about like you took all the words in your sentence and you kind of mixed it up like a salad. All the thoughts are there, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's hard to follow what this person is saying. In fact, I would highly encourage you, hit the pause button right now and click on this link right here. It is a video of a disorganized schizophrenic talking about what's going on, why they're there, and you just see this person's logic just jump all over the place. Where like some things make sense, but they're like non sequiturs left and right. And like it's really hard to understand what this person is talking about. That's one of the characteristics of disorganized speech. Here's some examples of delusions, right? Delusions of grandeur, thinking that you're greater than you actually are, or delusions of persecution, other people are coming after you or are bugging your house, for instance. There's all sorts of other delusions that people might have, just these false beliefs. Delusions of grandeur and persecution are two common ones, but there's a lot of other delusions that people can have. On a personal note, my second cousin, Billy Bob, I know his name is Billy Bob. Cousin Billy Bob lives in Oklahoma, and he was diagnosed with disorganized schizophrenia. And I remember going over to my aunt's house as a kid, and Billy Bob was there. And we were driving through, it was really late at night, so we stopped and we slept on the couch. And I remember my brother and I sleeping on this kind of pull-out couch, and then in the middle of the night, Billy Bob kind of walking through with a chainsaw. I remember stopping and thinking like, that's weird. Like, he shouldn't be having a chainsaw, like walking around the living room. But I was a little kid, I didn't think anything of it, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I saw this massive oak tree had been cut down outside Billy Bob's room in the middle of the night. So I asked my grandma, like, hey, why is that tree, cut down? And she explained, well, Billy Bob thought that there was FBI agents hiding in the tree last night, and they were listening into his thoughts and listening into his conversations from his room. So what he did in the middle of the night is he got up and he kind of cut down that tree. Disorganized behavior that's stemming from this delusion of being persecuted, in this case by the FBI. Next chapter, we'll talk a little bit more about therapies, and there are some biological therapies that focus on dopamine expressions in certain parts of the brain that take away some of those positive symptoms that people with schizophrenia experience. Positive symptoms, meaning in addition to normal functioning. Negative symptoms, meaning kind of taking away from. So lessening of that normal functioning. Some symptoms, not every person diagnosed with schizophrenia needs to have all of these symptoms. In fact, there are different types of schizophrenia I'll talk about in the next slide. But think about some of these negative symptoms, one of them being flat affect. So again, affect is just a fancy word for like how you feel. Are you expressing emotions? And a flat affect, meaning that this person is just like not smiling, not frowning, like not experiencing, not showing the normal range of emotion. When good things happen, you should express more happiness, or when bad things are happening, you should express more pain, displeasure, just as kind of flat, kind of plain affect over time across situations. They can also experience alogia, which means a poverty of speech. So when they're speaking, it might have brief, so like short sentences, short words, speaking really slow, or empty replies to questions. So in the speech salad, they're all over the place. A negative symptom of alogia would be speaking, but really poorly, or really slowly, and not getting it across. And another negative symptom is avolition. So avolition, think of this as like the absence of pursuing your goals and like starting your own behaviors and goal-directed tasks that you're engaging in. Avolition means like it's hard to get motivated for those things that you used to do. And avolition is one of the reasons why you find people diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to kind of drift to the social outskirts. They tend to become more homeless because they have a hard time holding down a job. They have a hard time like showing up to job and starting a task and completing a task. And given American problems with having enough resources for psychological disorders, what you found is a disproportionate amount of people with schizophrenia becoming homeless. And avolition is one of those. But we'll talk about, if not in this class, then definitely in abnormal psychology, about some of the systematic and social pressures that cause people with psychological disorders, most notably schizophrenia, to kind of drift to the social outskirts. Right? If it's hard for their friends and family to maintain those relationships, it's hard for their employers to maintain employment with someone that has these false delusional beliefs, disorganized behavior. It's hard to kind of track those people down. They tend to drift towards the outskirts, especially when the US still has a stigma and doesn't have the same sort of resources necessary to provide adequate treatment for folks. So anyway, that's a tangent, but definitely something to kind of take up either in a private conversation with me or via your future class in Psych 360 Abnormal. It's a really cool one. So I mentioned earlier that there's a few different types of schizophrenia. The first type of schizophrenia I want to talk about is paranoid schizophrenia. So paranoid schizophrenia is characteristic of people who have delusions of paranoia, that people are coming after them. So they're frequently on the run, they're frequently very distrusting, they will kind of break down any sort of situation that they're in, removing all the light bulbs to make sure that there's no like secret recording devices, for instance. So that sort of level of paranoia. Paranoid schizophrenics tend to do well with psychotic medication as well as therapy, trying to challenge the irrationality of those delusions of paranoia that they have. Another type of schizophrenia is a disorganized schizophrenic. So disorganized schizophrenia is characteristic of the disorganized speech, the word salad, disorganized behavior. It's hard to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they aren't completing their tasks in a logical way. So you might have a conversation, but the conversation isn't revealing. It doesn't follow the norms of a regular conversation. It's hard to track what this person is thinking. Another type of schizophrenia is a catatonic schizophrenic. And this picture over here is someone who is diagnosed as a catatonic schizophrenic. In these catatonic schizophrenia, they experience some of these avolition, alogia, where they will contort their bodies into what seem to be really uncomfortable positions and just not move at all for hours on end. So this real kind of lessening and reducing of kind of normal human functioning. And the last type is referred to as undifferentiated schizophrenia, which is more or less like kind of like a catch-all last category. If the symptoms don't seem to fit in one category versus the other, they have this kind of, well, if it wasn't paranoid, wasn't disorganized, wasn't catatonic, then it's this kind of undifferentiated schizophrenia. So the story I told you about my cousin Billy Bob, he was a paranoid schizophrenic. The person in the video that you watched a couple slides back was a disorganized schizophrenic. And this person over here was diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia. So what's going on with schizophrenia? Biopsychosocial. There's a biological piece to it. It's largely genetic, so hereditary, so passing down from generation to generation. You'll also find kind of post-mortem autopsies of people diagnosed with schizophrenia. The ventricle sizes in their brains tend to be larger. So the ventricle size is these circles over here that house cerebral spinal fluid. So the kind of liquid that's like coating your brain. And they aren't sure if this is with like the more kind of disorganized schizophrenia, where there's less of the neural connections, that the ventricles are growing over time, or if the ventricles were really large to begin with, and that was what was contributing to the development of schizophrenia. It's kind of a chicken and an egg problem right now, but they do know that ventricle size is associated with schizophrenia. And they also argue that dopamine plays a big role, the dopamine hypothesis. So excessive levels of dopamine, which are causing neurons in the brain to fire when they shouldn't. So excessive levels of dopamine, where you start hearing voices and seeing people that aren't truly there. So the antipsychotic medications that start reducing, like L-Dopa, start reducing the level of dopamine in their brain, are effective at reducing the positive symptoms of hallucinations. I mentioned earlier that there is a strong genetic piece to schizophrenia, and this chart kind of bears that out really well. What you find here, 1% of the population, and then when you start increasing the genetic closeness, cousins, aunts, nieces, nephews, you see that the percentage of people of a family member being diagnosed starts creeping up higher and higher. If mom and dad has schizophrenia, 13% chance that their children do. If your brother and sister has schizophrenia, 17% chance that you will as well. Even notice on identical twins, 48% chance. So this is someone who shares 100% of the same DNA, right? They were a monozygotic twin that kind of split from there. Even though they share 100% of the same genes, notice that it's only 48% likelihood that their identical twin will have schizophrenia. And that points to the diathesis stress model, that we all might have diatheses, right? Genetic predispositions to develop it, but do we encounter a sufficient stressor in our lives that will trigger the psychological disorder? Let's see here. So bio, that's bio. Psycho, so the person. You know, these perceptual problems, like difficulty separating fiction from reality, truth versus truth versus mistruth, or falsehoods. That was weird. So these are more the kind of cognitive components that a cognitive therapist would work with someone diagnosed with schizophrenia, most likely a paranoid schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenic, kind of challenging some of those irrational beliefs and setting them up for saying, hey, when you come up with these beliefs, how can we discern if it's true or not? What is a verifiable way of testing the world around us, and challenging some of those kind of blanket statements of, well, the government was just one step ahead of us, and they knew that they were going to, bug our room, and they knew we were going to search for the bugs, so they removed them already, things like that. So challenging some of those irrational thoughts. And then the group, I alluded to this earlier, that you have this kind of social selection, so of schizophrenics kind of drifting into lower SES. SES stands for socioeconomic status. So less educated, less likely to graduate from college, lower income, right? Harder to find and hold down jobs. There's also the social causation hypothesis out there. So it's not just that they're kind of drifting to these areas, that it's social causation, that the chronic and extreme stress that's associated with not having enough money, not having enough access to education and resources available to you, the stress of being homeless and not having a home over your head, all of that stress would be a sufficient enough stressor that would trigger a psychological disorder. So something to kind of keep in mind out. So there's certainly a social component to it, biopsychosocial. Man, it keeps getting more and more depressing. The thing that gives me optimism is there's so much research on understanding these are psychological disorders. This wasn't how people were created. This wasn't how people are supposed to be. This is abnormal. This is interfering with their daily life events. And therapy is effective at bringing people back into healthy, normal relationships, healthy, normal thoughts about themselves and what their body should look like. And these sort of distorted images that people have about themselves certainly rears its head with eating disorders. Sorry, one second. Let me turn this off. Sorry about that. So one of the let me talk about a few different types of eating disorders. A couple of them might sound really familiar, anorexia and bulimia. They're two different ones. Anorexia nervosa is referring to this kind of body image distortion. So they have these irrational beliefs about how much they weigh, that they think that they weigh more than they actually do. When they look at themselves in the mirror, they see, right, or they perceive someone who needs to lose weight, although they really don't. In fact, they're unhealthily underweight. People with anorexia nervosa, when they're talking about their own weight, they're typically talking about it at the ounce level. Oh, well, I'm overweight. I have a few more ounces to lose. That's that sort of hyper focus, this irrational belief that they're like so ingrained, that they feel like they need to lose weight. Anorexia and bulimia are both more common in women, but men can certainly develop both anorexia and bulimia as well. In fact, the men that are most likely to develop anorexia are the former wrestlers who are really hyper concerned with their weight, having to make a certain weight to qualify for a certain meet or a match or something like that, whatever it's called. And then knowing the kind of tricks of how to starve themselves and how to sweat out so much body mass and things like that to make weight. So anorexia versus bulimia. Anorexia, think of just this body image distortion. Bulimia, you still have this distorted body image, but bulimia is a lot more characteristic of this binge eating. So people will binge eat, they'll eat a full meal, they'll eat a lot, and then immediately after they'll purge that. So it's followed by a variety of efforts to prevent that weight gain. One of the ways that they can do that is either by like excessive exercising. So, not just a normal level of like, hey, we had a big dinner, let's all go for a walk. It's like, no, like, I ate a few too many like crackers for lunch today. Let me go, run on the treadmill for 3 hours. So either excessive exercising through purging, like vomiting up the food afterwards. So they might eat a lot, but then vomit it up before their body has a chance to absorb it and gain the nutrients and put on the weight from that. So it's not surprising with people that have bulimia to see the damage to their throat, esophagus, the teeth, all of the bile and the vomit from over time continuing to force yourself to throw up. You see the damage that it takes on their throat and their mouth. Other types of this purging is either using like excessive laxatives. So, like forcing the food to go through you as fast as possible. So your body doesn't have a chance to absorb all of those nutrients, or even, taking really, really cold baths afterwards kind of slow your metabolism after you eat. Here are some really unsettling pictures of people with anorexia. And these people, right, are hesitant to take their pictures because they think that they look overweight. They think that they look fat, and they're saying, well, no, like, don't take my picture. I'm self-conscious. I still have a few more ounces to lose. And they're literally starving themselves to death. You can see all the bones in their rib cage, in their spine. Like, you can see all of the bones. You can see that their bodies are literally going into starvation mode, where some of the normal kind of monthly cycles of menstruating and things like that, their body's really like pausing that, saying, hey, like we need to put all of our resources into keeping us alive today. So there are therapies that are effective that challenge these irrational body image perceptions that people have. We'll talk more about that next chapter. And we'll also talk about the importance of like a social setting as well, like a group setting. So eating disorders, biopsychosocial. From a biological perspective, there is a strong genetic predisposition, right? The heritability of psychological disorders. Sorry, I'm having a hard time talking. And another biological reason could be like feelings of satiation. So they might feel satiated, might feel full much earlier than their body should, right, to get the basic nutrients that they need. Another strong focus of therapy, biopsychosocial, is on the person. What you tend to find is that perfectionistic beliefs, that sort of perfectionistic mindset of, I have to get an A, and like getting really angry at the professor of like, hey, I only got a 99% on this assignment. What can I do better next time? Why am I not getting an A+? That sort of perfectionism like sounds good, right? But it's actually this irrational belief about this expectation about society, and these perfectionistic beliefs will get turned towards their body and saying like, this part over here, I have a little too much skin. I have a few more ounces to lose over here. This isn't right. So perfectionism is one of those warning signs. And then the group, what you certainly find is cultural differences here in the values of being skinny. From a sociological perspective, when food is really prevalent, what you find is in culture where food is really prevalent, the more skinny body types are seen as more attractive, desirable. But when food is really scarce, some of the larger body types as being more attractive. And you certainly see this in our marketing as well. When you start looking at social differences of like, what should someone's body look like? This is true for both men and women, but you see higher rates of anorexia and bulimia focused on diagnosed within women, and the marketing in our culture certainly seems to body shame women more than men. Here's an old advertisement: special teen diet, feels good to be thin. You can never be too thin, like a pretzel crisp. Like inherently subtle in this is this idea that like overweight is bad and being thin is good. Here's a picture of, what's her name, Jennifer Lawrence? I think that's her name. Normal picture, and then like photoshopped by the marketing agency afterwards to change the body type. So even the picture that we're seeing and comparing ourselves with isn't reality. Stop. All right. Next, I want to talk about dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders, there's a few different ones. There's dissociative amnesia and dissociative fugue. Dissociative amnesia, think of that like lack of memory. I'm not sure who I am. I'm not sure, who my friends are, who are you, things like that. As soon as you add travel to that, as soon as you kind of wake up, you don't know who you are, where you've been, and then you've traveled to another place. Now it's no longer dissociative amnesia, just kind of that forgetting who you are, amnesia. But as soon as you start traveling, then you have that fugue component. So dissociative fugue, you woke up on the other side of the country and you're not sure who you are, how you got there, and things like that. And the reason why people will develop into these dissociative states is when they encounter such a traumatic event that to deal with this stress, they kind of fracture. They either like repress the memory, they repress a really painful event, even if that whole event was who they are or how they traveled to that place. So that's what I mean of this disassociation, this disassociation, this kind of divergence between your sense of self. And a really intriguing type of psychological disorder is referred to as dissociative identity disorder, aka multiple personality disorder. So psychologists don't talk about multiple personality disorder, they call it DID, right? Dissociative identity disorder. When you experience such a trauma that instead of forgetting about it, dissociative amnesia, or forgetting about it and moving somewhere else, dissociative fugue, if you encountered such a traumatic event, what is possible is your identity fractures into different identities, each with different names, different skill sets, different personalities. One that is more equipped to deal with that stressor, and the other one that's more equipped to deal with a different aspect of life. And there's a lot of famous examples of this, of dissociative identity disorder. Folks like Sybil, I think there was a show on HBO or something, The United States of Terra, right? Using examples of people that experience such intense trauma that they fractured or split into different identities. And one identity is more equipped to deal with that kind of psychological pain than others. So you might be wondering, how would someone even develop like a multiple personality disorder? The kind of Freudian idea is, well, like in the psychodynamic view, you have this kind of inner conflict between yourself that if you can't deal with it, you kind of fracture, you push part of it into a subconscious or sub-awareness that only later creeps up when you need that skill set to deal with it. Personally, there's not a whole lot of support for this kind of psychodynamic view, of like Freud's idea of the id, ego, superego. So I would scrap that. Instead, there's more support for this kind of social cognitive view that people manage multiple roles. And when their identity fractures, kind of splits, they literally kind of become different roles, become different people. And to maintain the kind of like to compartmentalize the trauma and skill set of each person, they typically don't know other people's memories. In fact, for it to be a case of DID, dissociative identity disorder, they shouldn't have awareness of other identities' memories. They may know the names of other people's identities, but they shouldn't have access to those memories because it's really like a fractured sense of self. There are some psychologists that have gone their entire career and have never had a single diagnosable case of DID. So some psychologists think that's not a thing. Other psychologists have reported hundreds of cases of dissociative identity disorder. So there's certainly a disagreement in the field about how prevalent it truly is. It doesn't help that some cases like Sybil, who's really famous and brought a lot of attention to DID, later came back out and said that she faked the whole thing. So more of the belief now is that there are true cases of multiple personality disorder. It is very rare. It's very rare for people to have their personalities kind of fracture into different versions of themselves, but it is true. Here's a video of Gretchen, who is a grown adult who was sexually assaulted by her uncle when she was a child. She was molested. And to deal with this horrific sexual trauma, what Gretchen did is fractured into different identities. She had Gretchen, who's the main identity, and then Jane, who is this kind of fun, childish, loving, like still able to enjoy like the purity of being a child. And then Enigma, who dealt with the sexual trauma by becoming really strong, really vocal, very angry, very violent, that would fight off the sexual advances made by Gretchen's uncle. So what I would encourage you to do right now is pause this video. It's a long one, so scroll all of the way to 20 minutes and 20 seconds and watch this video. It is very, very intriguing. What you'll see is Gretchen switch into Jane, and Jane speaks differently. She has a different name, different accent, brings back different memories. And then later on in therapy, right, because you have three different versions of themselves, The therapist is trying to recombine those different identities. So what the therapist will do is like gradually start getting Gretchen to start bringing up some of the sexual assault and then start developing this coping mechanisms to deal with that as Gretchen and not revert to this secondary coping mechanism of fracturing into different versions. So at the very end, what you'll find is when Gretchen talks about the sexual assault, Enigma comes out. Seems like she's possessed, seems like it's some sort of demon, but it's not, right? It's not possession. Instead, it's just part of Gretchen's identity that she fractured off to deal with that intense, horrific child molestation. And the last thing I want to talk about today is psychopaths. Psychopaths and sociopaths. Both psychopaths and sociopaths are characteristics of impulsivity, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, lack of perspective taking. They have a hard time differentiating between other people having unique needs and wants and feelings. Instead, what they tend to see is other people as inanimate objects. Psychopaths were born that way. So psychopaths might have, when they were born, a lack of ability for perspective taking. They might have experienced some sort of traumatic brain injury that damaged their frontal lobe where they can't truly perspective take or something like that. Psychopaths were born that way. Sociopaths were socialized through culture, through experiences throughout their lives to turn down their empathy, to turn down their remorse and perspective taking for other people. So someone that is like a member of a gang, for instance, that has to jump other people into the gang, that has to act violently towards complete strangers, that can shoot rival gang members and not feel any remorse or anything like that, that night, it was probably really difficult for them the first time where they punch someone else, when they jump someone else into the gang. But notice, like over time, by being de-individuated, by being kind of dehumanizing the enemy, the rival gang, seeing more and more violence, they start turning down what they're capable of feeling and experiencing. That's a sociopath, where they are no longer capable of empathy and perspective taking and remorse because they've turned it down through their experiences. Psychopaths were never capable of doing that in the first place. And in fact, when you bring psychopaths into a lab and you strap them up to an fMRI machine and you show them a video of puppies being murdered, being like mutilated, most people's, their feelings go off the charts, right? They're threatened, this is distressful, like they have a whole range of emotions, right? And then later on, when you show a picture of a table being smashed, they don't show that same sort of emotion, the same sort of response, whatever, right? Because they know, like, this is puppies, this is an animate object, and this is a table, this is an inanimate object. When you show psychopaths those same videos, they have the same null reaction for both puppies being murdered and for a table being destroyed. They aren't, on a psychological level, differentiating the difference between them. In fact, psychopaths are incredibly manipulative and harmful to other people because they can lie and steal and take other people's resources and convince them to, to harm themselves, to harm other people, like in cult leaders and things like that. Or the like really dark, the Jeffrey Dahmers, the Ted Bundys, the serial killers engaging in violence as well. So here's a really cool interview with Ted Bundy. And I encourage you to hit pause right now, watch this video. And when you watch the video, you might have the belief that, hey, Ted Bundy got kind of a raw deal, that the real problem here is Hustler magazine, I think is what he blames, not him. And that he had a normal life and normal childhood and normal parents that loved him and cared about him. Hit pause, watch the video right now, and then come back. All right, now that you're back, everything that Ted Bundy just said, complete lie. He didn't grow up in a loving, two-parent household, things like that. In fact, Ted Bundy was forced to raise with his grandparents because his mother abandoned him because his grandfather sexually molested his mother, which gave birth to Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy didn't have like a loving childhood, grew up in, you know, two-parent Christian household, whatever. What Ted Bundy would do is he would traumatize his sister by going out to the side of the road, finding roadkill, and then putting the carcasses of dead animals into his sister's bed to see what sort of reaction that he would get from that. And what you find is some of the characteristics of psychopath is having like an early childhood fascination with death and murder and torture and mutilation of like harming animals. And what you find in cases of Ted Bundy, of how they escalated to eventually becoming like a serial killer, is they didn't just jump out into being a serial killer. Instead, what they started was small and slowly started working their way up. So what Ted Bundy would do is start with those animals, you know, messing with his sister, realizing that it wasn't really enough, sort of creeping into kind of online videos, magazines, the internet of violent pornography, of rapes and things like that. And for an initial point, that was enough. That was sufficiently stimulating where that would cause that same sort of reaction that he desired. But over time, he got used to that. So what he would do is start kind of stalking people, start watching people. And eventually, like, the stalking them wasn't enough. He actually needed to engaging in the rape himself. So started serial raping, and then to protect himself, the serial killing. He would store the bodies in the woods and then revisit their grave sites over times, necrophilia, right? Revisiting the dead bodies, corpses, to get that same sort of level of sexual arousal. So like just this escalation over time where he became more and more desensitized to violence. And the whole time, no one had any idea that he was doing this. He was incredibly charismatic. He was really likable. And you saw that in this video. In fact, when the police finally rushed Ted Bundy's house and arrested him, he was having a dinner party. And the people at the party were like, no, like, there must be some mistake, officer. Like, this is Teddy. Like, Teddy's our friend. Teddy's a really great guy. Like, what do you mean? Like, you're arresting Ted Bundy. What they didn't know is that Ted Bundy at the time was engaging in serial raping, serial killing, necrophilia. In fact, he even had a human head in his refrigerator in the garage. So he was eventually started going toward like cannibalism and things like that, just constantly being more and more aggressive, but not feeling the same sort of level of remorse and perspective taking as you and I would. Every psychological disorder we've talked about today gets better with therapy. And that is such a redeeming factor. Every single psychological disorder gets better with therapy, except for psychopathy. Psychopaths are the only psychological disorder out there that actually gets worse. They actually learn to become better psychopaths because they learn to become better liars. During therapy, they realize, oh, like, the reason why people were upset is because of this and that. They start learning like other people's emotions and what they expect and how to like feign that insincerity the whole time when they really didn't feel it all up. So psychopaths as well as sociopaths tend to be outstanding liars, excellent liars, and they learn to fake emotions through therapy. So they're the only group that actually gets worse. And they're often described as incredibly charming, intelligent, and fast talkers out there. So anyway, be careful when you're interacting with folks. Some clinical psychologists believe that the rate of clinical psychopathy is as much as 1% of the population out there. It's not that 1% of people are serial killers and serial rapists and necrophiles and things like that. Not at all. In fact, think of all the domains in American culture where it's advantageous to be charming and intelligent and a fast talker and a great liar and manipulative and charismatic and like all these things that you can use and then do work where you don't have to perspective take and feel remorse and you can pad your own budget. So things like American CEOs, where you can rob people of their retirement, like have the whole company go bankrupt, but you get some sort of golden parachute at the very end. Other people's lives are destroyed and you're going yachting for, in Barbados on some vacation and sleeping just fine that night. That's that lack of empathy, remorse, and perspective taking that's characteristic of psychopaths. So, all right, that's all I have for you guys. If you guys have any other questions about psychological disorders, let me know. Bring those questions with you on Wednesday. I'm looking forward to hearing them. And then the week after that, we'll talk all about the specific therapies and which ones are effective. So anyway, hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.